Good morning. This is Chair French convening the regular business meeting of the Kansas Corporation Commission for Thursday, May 16th. We do apologize for the brief delay. We had just a couple technical difficulties, but we're all here now. I'm joined by my colleagues, Commissioner Keene and Commissioner Keither. On today's agenda, we have 21 consent agenda items, one noticed item, and one discussion item, an SPP update. So we will begin with our consent agenda, commissioners. Let me ask at this time if you have any questions about the items on the consent agenda, and I will begin with Commissioner Keither.
I do not, thank you.
And Commissioner Keene. You are muted.
Give it a shot again. Thank you. No questions. Thank you. I would note that I am recusing from consent agenda item number 2, noting that recusal, then I would move that we approve the consent agenda.
Second.
All right, we have a motion and a second noting that one recusal. Is there any further discussion on the consent agenda? Hearing none, all in favor, please vote aye.
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 Aye. Any opposed, say no. The consent agenda is approved. We will now move to our one noticed item. This is a proposed penalty order in docket number 24 TRAM 665 PEN, and our presenter for this item is Mr. Ahsan Latif. Good morning, Ahsan.
Good morning, commissioners. The penalty order before you arises out of a compliance review of AAA Trucking LLC, a common carrier which hauls grain, feed, and hay operating out of Cimarron, Kansas. The special investigators found 59 violations, and the order before you penalizes 11 specific counts, resulting in $11,550 in total penalties. The violations, I'll briefly summarize. They include a $1,500 enhanced fine for failing to require drivers to prepare records of duty status. There were 23 violations found, and this was an enhanced penalty because of the same violation being found in a previous penalty order. There's also a $2,000 enhanced fine for failure to conduct pre-employment controlled substance testing, which is a repeat violation, a $600 enhanced fine for failing to conduct annual queries into the Federal Drug and Alcohol Clearinghouse, and a $1,400 enhanced fine for failing to conduct pre-employment queries into the Drug and Alcohol Clearinghouse, both of which were repeat violations, as well as a $3,000 fine for hauling loads that exceeded the legal gross weight limit of 85,000 pounds in Kansas. Additionally, staff found violations for failing to prepare maintenance records and annual inspections and for violating drug and alcohol program regulations. Staff believes the order appropriately assesses the penalties against the carrier and recommends approval of the order. And I and staff are available to answer questions you may have.
All right, thank you, Ahsan. Are there any questions on this item, beginning with Commissioner Keither?
No question, just find it a bit troublesome that there are so many repeat issues here.
And Commissioner Keene?
No questions. I would move approval of the order.
Second.
Got a motion and a second to approve the penalty order as described in this docket. Is there any further discussion on that motion? Hearing none, all in favor, please vote aye.
Aye.
Aye. Any opposed, say no. The order is approved. Thank you, Ahsan.
Thank you.
We will now move to our discussion item. This is the last item noticed on our agenda, but not least, and probably we will spend a few minutes on it. This is a quarterly update on Southwest Power Pool activities. And again, this quarter, we welcome Sherry Feist Albrecht, our SPP Workgroup consultant, to present on those activities. So Sherry, I will turn it over to you and let you take it away. We do see your PowerPoint on the screen, and looks like it's sharing quite nicely.
Oh, very good. All right, then. Good morning, commissioners. And this is the SPP quarterly update, and we don't have as much of a time lag this time as we did with the one in February. So I will advance to the next slide. And this is just a summary of the meetings that were held on May 6th and May 7th by the Regional State Committee, both an educational session as well as a business meeting, and then a joint stakeholder meeting, and then the board, followed by the board meeting on May 7th. We had a number of voting items on the RSC business meeting. several revision requests, revising portions of the tariff. Several of these you've seen before, and we'll elaborate further on them in the following slides, but I wanted to give you an idea of kind of the scope of what we had on our agenda. We also had reports as to the first quarter financials for 2024, as well as the cost allocation working group, which then provided a summary of the meetings held preliminary to the RSC meeting at the beginning of May. The revision request 607 addresses the safe harbor provisions that had been approved as a matter of policy by the RSC at previous meetings. This is the revision request preliminary to filing at FERC. Just as a reminder, the safe harbor applies to base plan upgrades that cost over $100,000 and sets a cost limit of $180,000 per megawatt times the capacity that's requested. It serves as a check on level investment. And there are essentially three criteria for eligibility for the safe harbor, one of which this revision request amends. It has a 125% resource limit that's been in place since 2005. Given the resource adequacy concerns and adjustments that have been made over the last year, the COG had been asked to take a look at making some possible revisions to that. The recommendation was to make some changes, as you'll see on this next page. This is a tariff revision, so it will be filed at FERC. But we've set 125% as the lower limit, and it adjusts. The safe harbor eligibility criteria will adjust to accommodate whatever the planning reserve margin is set in the criteria, which will be forthcoming later this year. Also define system peak responsibility in the SPP planning criteria, since that term is used within the tariff. The next revision request you've seen before, it's the availability policy. This was something that there was concern expressed about making sure that resources were available when they're called upon. And so it establishes a number of kind of good utility practices that must be performed to assure the availability of that resource. And you'll see those business practices here. And this is the same slide that you saw in, gosh, probably March, I believe it was, when we last visited this, but I've just included it again, just so you'd have a reminder of what those business practices are. A similar and kind of a companion revision request to the availability policy is this revision request 616, which is an improved outage policy. It includes some business practice language to address some specific scenarios and their impacts on equivalent forced outage rates calculations. And these are all used for the E4D calculation is used to determine the accreditation for a resource. And so the policy makes sure that the outages, any outage extensions, any derates that are not approved by the balancing authority are captured as events for the purposes of performance-based accreditation. In other words, the accreditation will take a hit if the outages are not approved. And so that, and just so you are aware, I'll make this statement up front. I think I've included it on each slide as pertinent, but all of the RSC motions were unanimous.
This was not a very controversial quarterly meeting. I don't know if it's, I don't think it's reflected in your slides, but I did want to tell the commissioners that we had Commissioner Christie come and join us. FERC Commissioner Mark Christie came and joined us for these meetings, and I had to apologize. He wanted to see how the RSC operated and the SPP board operated, and I had to apologize that we didn't have any chairs being thrown across the room. There wasn't a lot of big debate on the policy items up at this quarterly meeting. They were everything went pretty smoothly. We made it look like we were one big happy family. So it was a good quarterly meeting.
And then that brings us to, I inserted this slide since we're kind of on a resource adequacy. I've pretty much completed the discussion of the voting items on resource adequacy, but I wanted to kind of take you through where we've been and where we're headed, and some of the issues that are there. As you can see, we have completed these chunks here. The normalized EUE standard will likely be, I don't know if we'll have a policy discussion about it. I think it's gonna, there have been several policy discussions related to it. I don't know that there has been a vote on it as a policy per se. But it's anticipated that will be part of the planning reserve margin revision request, that there will be some adoption of that. So whether there's an adoption of the policy prior to the revision request, I'm not sure. Value of lost load is something, the REAL team it was on the REAL team agenda in April for approval of the methodology for value of lost load. That meeting ran out of time, and so that will likely be on the next REAL team meeting, which is scheduled for next Friday. I would anticipate the meeting materials for that meeting will be released probably tomorrow, which is typical that they're released a week in advance of the meeting. So I'm not absolutely certain, but I'm guessing that one will definitely be deferred since it was not addressed at the last meeting. As you can see, and as I've mentioned, as we're talking here, a couple of big issues are coming before, will be coming before the RSC in August, and will be before the REAL team at next Friday's meeting as well. That would be the revision request 622, which would set the winter and summer planning reserve margins. There was a straw poll taken at the April meeting, and SPP staff's recommendation has been to set the winter PRM at 36% and the summer PRM at 16% beginning in 2026, I believe it is. The supply adequacy working group has also, I mean, they're the primary owners of this revision request. They did take a vote in the latter part of April, in which they advanced a recommendation of 33% for winter and 16% for summer, but they also desired to have a transition period, which would require some adjustment of the sufficiency valuation curve language that was added after the last planning reserve requirement. As you may recall, that sufficiency valuation curve was kind of a transitional tool used to adjust deficiency payments in the event that a load responsible entity was unable to meet the new accreditation values, or the PRM values, I'm sorry.
Sherry,
So,
I thought maybe I'd just give a little more
Sure.
context on the PRM discussion, since it wasn't something up for a vote here, but our commissioners are going to be hearing a lot about it in the coming months.
Sure.
As you all recall, we increased the summer planning reserve margin from 12 to 15% was it last year or 2 years ago, Sherry?
I think it was 2 years ago now.
It was 2 years ago. But now we are looking at evaluating it again, and now you're hearing about it. Maybe a little confusing, but now you're hearing two different numbers, and that's because we're in the process of adding a winter planning reserve margin as well. So a number that people need to carry in excess in the winter season. So when Sherry says, you know, the numbers being floated around are 36% and 16% or 33% and 16%. What we're talking about is probably the summer planning reserve margin, which is all we have right now, will probably increase from 15% to 16%, so a slight increase. And then the new winter planning reserve margin, which we do not currently have, would be set somewhere in the 30 to 40% range, depending where these votes end up going. I do want to say that sounds like a scary number. It sounds like, wow, that's a lot higher than the summer reserve margin. But something to keep in mind is that we are still a summer peaking system. And so actually currently, Sherry can correct me if I've got the numbers wrong, but I think as a system, we carry something like 37% excess reserves in the winter right now. So if we were to set it at 36%, it's pretty close to what we currently have. If we set it at 33%, we would actually be kind of sending a signal that we could have less reserves in the winter, which you know, personally, I'm a little concerned about sending that signal, but those votes are yet to be taken. We still want to hear all the data. We want to hear from the load serving entities, but just want to give a little context because I know in the coming months, commissioners will be hearing about a new winter planning reserve margin that our utilities will have to comply with, and a slightly higher, probably, planning reserve margin for the summer. We had the 12 to 15% increase. It is looking likely that they will have a 15 to 16% increase in the coming months. So just wanted to kind of level set on that, make sure. I think Sherry's mentioned it in past updates, but these are, you know, they're big things. They're going to get a lot of discussion, and they will be voted on and move forward later this year. And so want to make sure nobody's surprised by that. So Sherry, I don't know if you have anything else to add. I just wanted to make sure I level set on those, make sure people were aware they were coming.
No, I certainly appreciate that, and I don't have anything to add to that. I would note that it's my understanding that the normalized EUE standard will probably be woven into that revision request 622. That is something that SPP has used and considered as part of their loss of load expectation studies in the past. It's just that there has not been an established value for that. So that is something that's under consideration as well. There is also the fuel assurance revision request 621. I think that one is in really good shape. That has undergone quite a bit of discussion, and I think from the perspective of the supply adequacy working group, from the REAL team, I think those two groups are pretty well aligned on the draft language for that revision request. They still are pending votes at COG and RSC.
And maybe I'll just do another
and
little
MOPSI as well.
Little level set on that one for the other commissioners, since I'm sure that, you know, they don't follow the lingo of fuel assurance or OMC or RRs. So just a reminder that so we talked about, Sherry updated that we took a vote on an availability policy, a generator availability policy, and how people's accreditations would be impacted if their generators were not available when they said they would be. And generally that policy said if your generator wasn't available and you expected it to be, or you told SPP it would be, then you would be dinged when it came to accrediting the capacity from your generator. One big caveat of that is things like out of management control events, which is the OMC you see with fuel assurance. And one of those would be something like a winter storm. And if your generators, if certain generators don't show up during extreme events, that's outside their control, sort of force majeure type of conditions. And under that availability policy, we don't pick that up in your accreditation. But we all recognize that needs to be picked up in accreditation in some way. I mean, we're pursuing all these policies because of extreme weather events, and we want to understand better how our generation units perform during extreme events or during all times of the year. And so this policy is to try to pick that up in some way. It's a calculation to try to understand how units are going to perform during those types of events, and then to build that into their accreditation. So, and as Sherry mentioned, a lot of good work has been going on at all the working groups, and I think we're probably in pretty good shape to have a policy with broad stakeholder support, that's balanced and treats all the resource types pretty fairly, recognizes their value, not just in extreme events, but also that maybe there are some resources that haven't performed well in extreme events, but they're workhorses that provide a lot of value throughout the whole year. So that would be a danger of setting, a policy that values resources only based on how they do during extreme events. That's probably not something we want either. So that's going to be an important policy coming up, and I think we are in good shape to see pretty broad support from pretty diverse stakeholders on that issue. So sorry, Sherry, for for digging in there again. I just wanted to kind of level set and remind the commissioners what that's all about.
Sure. No, it's very helpful for all to understand. So the PRM stabilization, that's an effort to find ways to keep looking forward on planning reserve margins and anticipating needs to address them. The loss of load expectation studied a couple of different years in their assessment. They study year 3 and year 6. And so year 3 for purposes of the current LOLE study was 2026, and year 6 is 2029. So part of the last real team meeting was a suggestion that they start looking and delving into what the 2029 recommendations might be to give load responsible entities a heads up and to drive towards a little bit more stabilization. I don't know. This at this point is a policy consideration. I don't know if there's any particular process that's envisioned for that. I do know that they're trying to build a communication plan in so that those increases in PRM can be anticipated well in advance of the need for them to occur. So that's what that policy is intended to do, is to provide some of that certainty moving forward. Demand response. There is a revision request that that's being worked on. It's to figure out how to accredit demand response resources. And so that is being worked through. There is I believe there is a demand response team that's working, I think on a weekly basis, trying to drive towards accomplishing that in October. A ramping resource adequacy requirement is under consideration. That's kind of on a back burner for now. It's something that the real team has had kind of within one of its subgroups, but it's primarily a market working group effort, I think, at this point in time. I'm not sure what the status of that is, but that's driving towards an October 2024 policy decision with a revision request hopefully ready for January of 2025. The next item I want to discuss is the consolidated planning process and provide some background. The SPP has created a consolidated planning process task force. It really came, it was born out of the strategic and creative reengineering of integrated planning team, the SCRIPT effort. which was trying to figure out ways to develop some broad changes to transmission planning processes. There are a number of different planning processes within SPP, the integrated transmission planning process, the generation interconnection process, there's a variety of planning processes and interconnection processes. And so they're trying to find ways to take a look at that to maybe streamline some of those processes to better meet customer needs and also to resolve the concerns about the length of time, the backlog that exists in the generator interconnection queue, as well as just to provide some certainty going forward about the amount, nature, and funding of continued transmission investment, especially amid all the changes that are occurring. And so the CPPTF was created to sort of hone in on consolidating those transmission planning processes. And so the goals that they have are to develop some improvements to address multiple needs at a lower overall cost. So a lot of it used to be a lot of project by project planning and was done on a project by project basis. And there might be multiple needs that could be better served if they were considered not so much on that isolated project by project basis. So they're looking at some of those types of improvements. And the goal is to provide some cost certainty and planning, especially to generation interconnection customers. So to accomplish that, CPPTF has been focusing on an entry fee framework. It's primarily geared to the generation interconnection process, but it would serve. The framework is just to make sure that there's transparency and how things are funded, to provide some certainty, to streamline processes for implementing those upgrades, especially when they involve multiple stakeholders. And I've listed some of them there: the load serving entities, the generator developers, end users, as well as serving the overall needs of the region. So that framework includes several safeguards, and there have been some negotiated boundaries to optimize cost sharing among those stakeholder groups, to proactively plan and to streamline cost allocation. The process will use a 20-year assessment period, and there's also plans for a transition study to take place to try to establish some of the parameters for what that looks like going forward once the entry fee framework was developed. And I'll just say that this does have some relationship to Order 1920, which FERC just recently released. And I think that provides for a longer term assessment period. So that was something that was in the NOPR for this transmission planning order. And I think SPP did well in anticipating some of those timeframes in the work on this entry fee framework.
Sherry, what kind of time are we talking about? Do we know?
For the entry fee, for when this might go into place?
When the task force makes its recommendations.
Well, they made the recommendation on the entry fee framework. Now, what they're working on now, so that's what this slide is here, and the RSC did vote unanimously to approve this. So they've established the framework, and the next step will be for them to develop a revision request. And I think they're targeting November for an RSC vote on that. But there will be a transition study that takes place before it's actually implemented. And I'm not sure if I know the answer to the time frame that it'll take for, and Chair French may know,
I
what the
think
time frame is on the transition study. I
I
don't,
think the transition study may be lined up with the ITP 2025, the 2025 ITP, and then the 2026 may be the first full year of the consolidated planning process if all FERC approvals go as planned. That's sort of my understanding. So we're still kind of a couple years out. It's a transition period from all of our, current planning processes to start to roll into this new consolidated planning process. It's a big effort and I don't even know if a 2-year transition is really gonna be sufficient. And again, that's assuming all kinds of FERC approvals. Maybe one thing, maybe this is the right time to mention it since I mentioned FERC approvals. And Sherry mentioned the recent order 1920, which I don't know if folks are following that closely, but FERC just issued a very large 1,360 page order on long-term transmission planning, which I think we're all trying to dive into a little bit now. And I can say I've personally spoken to at least 2 of the 3 FERC commissioners over the last 2 weeks, and I've spoken to a few FERC staffers. Mark Christie was obviously at this meeting where we discussed this consolidated planning process at the SPP quarterly meetings. One thing I've just tried to impress on them is I do think this, my preliminary read is I think it does line up with some of the direction that FERC is giving on long-term planning. But it also is a very different approach. In some ways, SPP is going its own way on how it's going to plan. It's not exactly sort of the framework that FERC describes in its documents, even though I think it does probably meet their minimum requirements. But one, I've just tried to impress on them that SPP is trying to do its own thing. We think that it is in some ways superior and better for our region than maybe the minimums that they lay out, and want to make sure that nothing that they're putting in regulation would prohibit us from moving forward with this framework. The feedback I've gotten so far is that they are aware of this effort at SPP. They think it's interesting. And it is not their intent to slow us down in any way, but that's one thing that I know we're all going to be looking at closely is because we are going to do things a little differently than other regions, and it does involve long-term planning. We just need to make sure that it is going to comply. I frankly don't think we're going to have any issues. Most of what's in FERC's order 1920, as I dug in more, some of the earlier reports were that it was quite broad and that there were some unexpected things. But as I've dug in, it actually looks like it's pretty consistent with what the initial proposed rule was. There is not a lot in the order that I think either SPP does not already do, SPP and all the larger planning regions do not already do, or could not make some very minor changes to tweak their processes to make sure they're meeting those requirements. So, as the more I've dug into it, the more I've been comforted. I want to spend some more time with it. But probably my biggest concern is just making sure that as SPP tries to go sort of a new direction, that we aren't somehow hampered by new regulations that the FERC is handing down. I don't think that's their intent, but I know that's something people in our region will be concerned, just to make sure that we can continue to improve our processes, make them better for all the stakeholders in our region, and not be having to comply with something that doesn't really fit the new model that we're moving toward. So more to come on that.
one of the other items that the RSC was asked to weigh in on was a price formation policy. This arose out of some of the effects that we're seeing in Winter Storm Uri, and it's an effort to revise the price solutions so that a fair price is the end result. So during load shedding and emergency energy assistance events, the market obligation is reduced, and with that, the pricing could be suppressed when the resources are dispatched to the lower obligation in the market. So it modifies the pricing solution by removing those events, and then dispatching the price and pricing the system based on the true market obligation. So that's something that went through the market working group, through the REAL team, and through MOPSI, all of which voted on virtually. Most of the votes were, if not unanimous, very close to unanimity. And the ask was for the RSC to endorse this policy, which it did unanimously. Revision request 600.10. This revision request and the next one I'll talk about are revisions that are being made to the SPP tariff to accommodate the addition of the Western utilities and members of SPP. And they're intended to satisfy the terms and conditions that those members agreed to, tentatively agreed to, and I guess actually if they formally agreed to them, I believe about a year ago. And so these revision requests put in place those commitments. In any event, the RSC did unanimously approve these next two as well. This is this congestion over DC ties. We discussed this at a policy level. And the RSC did approve this way of handling congestion over the DC ties back in July of 2022. The bullets here explain the details of that, but these are the DC ties there are like 7 DC ties between the East and the West interconnection. I think there are only 4 there are only 4 DC ties that we're concerned with here. And I'm trying to remember what the total capacity is. I think it's 500 megawatts, 550 megawatts, something like that. And they are, they're subscribed, fully subscribed. And I think the flows are both ways across these ties. And so this is just a way of addressing any congestion that may be occurring over the DC ties. And the decision was to kind of have 2 phases to how you handle congestion. So this explains how they're going to clear the day ahead market and how those congestion rents will be distributed. So and then the settlements process will move. It provides a transition period essentially. And then after the 4 years of the transition, they'll move to the approach that the TCR market approach does on the east side. The next revision request has to do with resource adequacy between the East and the West. And so this is just, there was some perceived discrepancy in some of the language. As I mentioned earlier, these are fully subscribed lines, and there's really no available capacity on them as a result. WAPA had wanted to include some language that would have, I think, anticipated there being capacity on the lines, but that would have been inconsistent with the current process within SPP. And so the WAPA language was initially approved by SOG and COG and RTWG, but that proposed language failed at MOPSI, and there was a revision made at MOPSI that removed that language and substituted some language that tied firm transmission service for being used for capacity across those West DC ties, which would be consistent with how transmission service is used in the eastern portion of SPP. So that was MOPSI version was approved by the RSC unanimously. The joint stakeholder briefing, this one is, there's no action that's taken at this. This is just briefing on these issues before the SPP board, as well as stakeholders, members committee, and the RSC, and just the general public in attendance. There's always a FERC update. That's usually done by Patrick Clary of FERC staff. Transmission planning update, operations update, markets, and the market monitoring unit is not a typical briefing item on this stakeholder briefing, but they did review the results of the state of the market during this briefing. The board of directors and members committee meeting, they also approved everything that had been before the RSC, the safe harbor, the resource availability. Somehow I have congestion hedging in the wrong spot, but in any event, the approved outage policy. And then you'll see here this RR 600.1 to 600.16. Those are all tariff revision requests that are related to the Western expansion. Only 2 of these were subject to RSC authorities, and that's why we have the rest of them were subject to the board authority, and they approved all of those. And then just so you, whoops, I hit the wrong button. And then there were several consent agenda items. There were a few changes that were made to the RTO West or to the SPP bylaws to account for RTO Western expansion. I think there were some references to generally to WAPA, and there's some other WAPA related entities that needed to, that names needed to be expanded to include those. There was the financial audit report, benefit plan funding, a revision request having to do with emergency operating plans for SPP as the reliability coordinator, a transmission owner selection process, the industry expert panel. I left an L off there. And then there were a few SPP projects, project matters that required board attention because they were either out of cycle project reevaluations or out of bandwidth projects. And I believe that concludes, I think that's my last, oops, no.
Sherry,
Okay.
before you, Sherry,
Sure.
pardon my interruption. Before you move on to, let's go back to the previous slide, just ever so briefly, if you can.
Okay.
To the extent you can inform us, what's the extent, the scope of the Western expansion?
Well, and related to this, I wanted to mention the RSC will be forming a task force. The president of the RSC announced the formation of a task force to address RSC bylaws changes that will be necessary to accommodate that expansion. So from an RSC perspective, there's I think Wyoming, Colorado, I think Arizona and Utah may likely be joining the RSC. Montana already has, I think, could join the RSC regardless of the Western expansion, but they have not elected to do so. I don't know whether there's any consideration there or not. In terms of the number of utilities that are becoming members, I don't know that I recall the precise number. There are a couple in 2 or 3 in Colorado. I can get you that list if you would like to know utilities involved.
Yeah, since I followed this, but not as closely as either you or the chair, it seems like every time I turn around, we've got a new state that's added. We've really grown quite. SPP's really grown quite aggressively recently, and that was the reason for the question.
And I do have a map that shows the western expansion. I'll provide you the map as well as a listing of the utilities that would be joining. We've, over the last year, there have been several commissioners from some of the western state commissions that have visited and attended quarterly RSC meetings. And I'm trying to remember, have I missed any state?
No, I think you've mentioned all that I would have thought of. I had the same thought on Montana. I think Montana already could join, but have not engaged. I'm sure there's been outreach to them to invite. Mary Throne from Wyoming has been at a couple meetings, including these last meetings in Colorado. Eric Blank, the chair of the Colorado Commission, has been at least one. We had Thad LeVar, who's no longer with the Utah Commission, but he has attended in the past. So we've had pretty good attendance from them to understand what they might be getting into.
And the president of the RSC just released some information about kind of the task force, and I don't think I'm not exactly sure when that's going to get kicked off formally, but he's in the process of formulating a plan for putting that group to work. I do know that Pat O'Connell of the New Mexico Commission will be leading that task force. I believe Commissioner Tate from Arkansas has agreed to participate, as well as Commissioner Francis from Louisiana.
Yeah, and I mean, I would probably drive home. At least the thing I'll be watching for with that task force is it's all about our bylaws and our governance structure. And yes, we might be forming a single RTO, and we may have at times a single RSC with both East and West commissioners. But I think at least for the foreseeable future, it will be operated mostly as two separate systems, making their own investments. They're going to have be balanced separately on the East Interconnect and the West Interconnect. And there are going to be a lot of areas, maybe cost allocation is going to be separate. There are going to be, and planning for transmission is obviously going to be separate. So we need to be very careful about who's voting on what. And are there areas where it would not be appropriate for the Eastern commissioners, for example, to be taking a vote on how costs should be allocated among the Western investments and vice versa? If investments are taking place in the East and only affecting and benefiting Eastern states for right now, while we are pretty much separate, probably would not be appropriate for Western commissioners to be voting on items like that. And that's just an easy thing to pick off. But I think that's the purpose of the task force, is to drill down and make sure the governance makes sense, that if we need to make some changes, we will, that the right people have have authority and jurisdiction and ability to vote on things that affect and impact their end use customers, and that we don't have people voting on things that really only affect other states. So it's a little tricky, and when you've maybe got a single RSC, a single SPP, quote unquote, but really have two separate systems, at least for the time being. So I think that's really, at least how I envision the task force focus to be.
I appreciate that granularity. It is helpful for perspective. I'm not trying to be terribly provincial. Some ways I don't even mind being provincial, quite frankly, because I'm concerned about whether it's resource allocation or cost allocation. I'm concerned about the best interest of Kansas ratepayers. We all are. But we have some legacy issues that haven't dealt with the subject of cost allocation as well as I think it should in protecting the interests of Kansans, where basically we have a lot of a lot is being transported out of state. And now we have, with the growing size of SPP, and again, I don't mean to sound too provincial, but we have an increasing diversity in the approaches that these states take to either having zero emissions requirements or having restrictions on certain kinds of baseload. So I'm just concerned about that, protecting the home front. I'm not saying we all aren't, but that was the reason for the question.
And just to kind of bring you up to speed on some of the other issues that are pending for cost allocation. The cost allocation working group is currently looking at one of the holistic integrated tariff team recommendations, which is referred to as C1. And right now, the SPP footprint is composed of 18 legacy pricing zones. And so there has been a deliverability study that was done, also part of that HIT process, which has recommended that for deliverability considerations and the actual flow of electrons, creating three deliverability areas. And so those are those larger zones. So what COG is now considering is whether or not the cost allocation processes that we have in place should decouple some of those what are known as Schedule 9 pricing zones from the Schedule 11. So the more local from the larger, more regional areas. And so we're looking at what the cost allocation policy ought to be. What should we be recommending to the RSC? Should we use those three deliverability zones? Should we look at some other configuration for cost allocation purposes? And so we're in the process of gathering some additional data to consider. We have quite a bit of data on that advances the three deliverability areas, but COG has recently made the request to take a look at 2 additional zones. So what would cost allocation look like if it were 5 zones instead of 3? So we're continuing to work on that issue. I think we'll be voting on that in June.
And
I'll
Sure.
Go
Sherry,
ahead.
I just thought I would another level set just to remind commissioners, because there's a lot of technical language in those bullet points, but just as a reminder, this item actually goes to the item Commissioner Keene just raised of some of our legacy cost allocation challenges, particularly out in Western Kansas. And if you'll recall, I went and presented at the down at the legislature during this last session on some of the improvements that we are hoping can get pushed across the finish line at SPP to address those issues. And this item HIT C1, in addition to a couple others, was one of the larger things that we want to work with the Western Kansas entities to push across the finish line. And the whole idea there is if we would consider larger pricing zones, that would better consider where the generation that exists way out in Western Kansas, where it actually flows to. The fact that it actually does flow all the way east, but primarily to sort of the Northeast Kansas load center, but also to areas of Missouri. And so just a reminder that HIT C1, that's a boring name, but for a very important topic, and something that we have committed to try to continue to pursue at SPP. And as Sherry said, I think it is moving forward to a vote here pretty soon. And we want to see, we would like to see, larger zones in general. I think there are some specific areas of SPP that are not as aligned on that. But I think at least within our area of Kansas and Missouri, I think we seem to be getting pretty good consensus that it does make sense to pursue that. So just wanted to highlight and bring everybody back and remind you that is one of those items that we committed to the legislature that we are working on and we think is going to improve cost allocation in the future.
And then the other item that we had hoped to be able to bring to a vote of the RSC by the May meeting, but we're unable to, is the joint targeted interconnection queue. The revision request is 620. As you may recall, there are 5 projects that have been identified between SPP and MISO, within and between SPP and each of SPP and MISO, for which DOE funding has been secured. And the processes for getting those projects up and going is what's been referred to as that joint targeted interconnection queue. The RSC has approved the policy behind this revision request. The holdup right now is just trying to, for the constructing transmission owners, they were wanting to develop some tariff language around direct billing and what that would look like, both within SPP and MISO. And SPP and MISO are trying to coordinate the filing of their tariff revisions so that they can be filed on the same day at FERC. They also have a joint operating agreement that kind of works hand in hand with these JTIQ changes, and they'd like to have them. They'll probably be submitted separately to FERC, especially SPP and MISO tariff provisions will definitely be filed separately, but they'd kind of like them to be a coordinated filing at FERC. They are working out the details. We've spent 2 days this week going over rate templates to be developed to address some of those direct billing issues, and the tariff language has been developed. The COG will be holding a special meeting next Thursday morning so that we can vote on this revision request. Whether that will drive a special meeting of the RSC, I don't know for sure. But that's where that one stands. Then the FERC update. I think you're all pretty familiar with revision request 584 and Sunflower's cost allocation, the filing that SPP made in March of this year to add essentially four identified projects. They would be actually added to Schedule 3 of Attachment J to the tariff, so that they would live in the tariff itself for the allocation of the cost of the remaining annual transmission revenue requirements for those upgrades. Those, the FERC docket I have identified there. There have been several protests, motions to intervene filed. It's undergoing the process. My guess is that the effective date of June 1st, 2024 probably won't come to fruition, but I guess you never know. So that process is unfolding at FERC as we speak. Then the other FERC items I wanted to make you aware of. I know we've spoken before about the performance-based accreditation and then the electric load carrying capability accreditation process that exists for renewable resources. Those tariff revisions were submitted by SPP in 2024. They each have their own dockets. There have been there's quite a bit of activity in those dockets as well, interventions, I think maybe a couple protests. But separately from that, the Sierra Club and a couple of other entities have filed a complaint under Section 206 of the Federal Power Act, challenging the existing resource adequacy methodology that SPP has as being unjust and unreasonable. SPP recently filed an answer to that complaint, I believe late last week. That too has a lot of interveners in it. So those are ongoing activities at FERC that we'll be keeping an eye on.
I believe that is my last slide.
Well, I don't have
So-
any questions for you, Sherry, but we'll turn to our other commissioners to see if they've got anything that needs addressed. See, Commissioner Keene's gone off mute.
Could we take down the screen share so
Sure,
we see everybody?
there we go.
Well, first of all, and above all, thank you once again, Sherry, for an outstanding report. Your report is certainly one of the highlights of every quarter for me because it gives me a chance to kind of bring myself up to date on these kinds of matters, and they're all serious matters. What I would like to do is, with the indulgence of all of you, is move back just a little bit and let's talk because we have this is an interesting forum. Not only does it bring SPP issues to the forefront, but it brings other issues that affect the commission to the forefront as well. And it gives us an opportunity to speak with each other, which in the absence of a public forum, we can't about some of these substantive matters. I want to go back and address just a little bit, if we can, and get the take of Sherry, you and the chair, and Commissioner Keither as well, on this FERC Order 1920. I'd like to talk about that just a little bit more. I have spent, within the last day and a half, I've spent a fair amount of time on this, trying to bring myself up to speed on what is here. And as the chair alluded to earlier, I didn't want to interrupt the context of the conversation that the two of you were having about that issue, and when you took it up earlier, because I want to kind of go out to a broader level of discussion, and a really concern that I have, and have you address those concerns if you would. As the chair indicated, this order runs to some 1,300 plus pages, and it includes a 77-page dissent by Commissioner Christie and a 14-page concurring opinion by Chair by Chair Phillips and Commissioner Clement. When I look through this, honestly, I have great concerns about the future role of the states in transmission planning and in cost allocation as well. Indeed, just yesterday I saw where NARUC had issued a public statement expressing concern and general disappointment. I'm quoting from Greg White's language here, generally disappointed by the significantly diminished state role envisioned by FERC order with respect to transmission planning and cost allocation. He goes on to say, in light of our recent joint task force with FERC on electric transmission and the newly proposed collaboration, we hope that there will be future opportunities to ensure that state voices are heard. And I think the fact that NARUC would go to such an extent to actually publicly express their concern probably underscores that below the surface there is a great level of concern on some issues. And with regard, go ahead, please.
Well, I just might address that a little bit since I
Sure.
was a member of the task force. I can tell you the task force, at least a few of us members have had some conversations since then, and you know it was certainly NARUC's choice to put out a statement. I perceive that their statement probably had something to do with some of the cost allocation decisions.
Sure.
I think we were a little disappointed in the statement because I think there is much more diversity among us than what was reflected in that statement. I think a good number of us have been discussing the fact that we think our voices and the discussions that took place at our task force meetings, there's definitely a through line of the input that we gave and what came out of the transmission planning NOPR. I mean, I think there are, unfortunately, there have been some elements that have been politicized. But as far as the nuts and bolts of transmission planning and what we all think needed to be done to move things forward, I think a good number of the task force members believe that the order moves that forward in a pretty constructive way. And I think we thought it was a little disappointing that NARUC would put out a statement. just expressing broad disappointment when obviously our take on something would be much more nuanced than the statement we saw. So certainly their prerogative to do that and their leadership to choose to do that. But I don't think I would take that 4-sentence statement or whatever it was as sort of the statement of the task force. And I think we were a little disappointed that the task force itself was invoked. So I didn't mean to cut you off, and I do think it's, it is important to recognize that they put out a statement, but I also think that some of the members were a little concerned that it could be construed as sort of a political statement when we would not have necessarily signed up for a political statement.
Well, I'm not offended by the interruption at all. I appreciate your take on it. Actually, as Paul Harvey would say, sometimes there is a rest of the story, and I think you're giving some part of the rest of that story here. I want to become really quite more specific. I'm going to move away from any general conclusions we may not even think about reaching about NARUC's statement into more specifically some of the concerns that were expressed about protecting state interests that were noted by Commissioner Christie in his dissent. More specifically, I'm going to hone in on what I think are 3 really important concerns that he has expressed. The first, I think, notes that, and this is his take, that the final rule reverses the state's roles in transmission planning and cost allocation that was held forth or promised by the NOPR to which he subscribed. He states, and I'm just taking this within the context of what he has proffered here. He says, unfortunately, perhaps emanating from the final rule's erroneous legal conclusion that the commission, that means FERC, of course, has exclusive jurisdiction over regional transmission planning and cost allocation, the final rule completely eviscerates the state's role contemplated in the NOPR in both the transmission planning and cost allocation processes. The second, if you would care to address that, you can. There's 3 of these. We can do them one at a time, or I just go ahead and basically spit them out, and then we can talk about them. Why don't I do that? Let me just go through all 3 of them, and then we can talk about it more generally. Secondly, Commissioner Christie has noted that the final rule undercuts I'm using pretty much his language here, undercuts the state's role in the transmission planning process. Specifically, he notes that there's a major example of the final rules undercutting the state's role in the transmission planning process with respect to the selection criteria. Of course, the selection criteria are key components of the planning process, because once a project is selected, money starts to flow from ratepayers to transmission developers. In the new rule, FERC clarifies, as Christie notes, that the FERC requires transmission providers to seek support from relevant state entities, but does not require transmission providers to obtain their support before proposing an evaluation process and selection criteria on compliance. More specifically, Christie notes that the final rule even fails to require that transmission providers indicate in their compliance filings whether the states agree with their selection criteria proposal. He continues that, in his opinion, what adds insult to injury in the final rule is that the final rule specifically provides that transmission providers, and he's quoting from the rule here, transmission providers may not include in their evaluation processes or selection criteria any prohibition on the selection of a long-term regional transmission facility based upon the transmission provider's anticipated response of a state public utility commission or consumer advocates to a particular long-term regional transmission facility. And third, and I'm just trying to get these things as generic as I can to try to be succinct. FERC Commissioner Christie notes that the final rule guts and, in his language, eviscerates the state's role in deciding cost allocation matters as proposed in the NOPR. And I think this is probably, for me, one of the real critical concerns that I have here within the context of the rule. When all the provisions of the final rule are taken together, it is Commissioner Christie's view that the states are simply cut out of any significant role in the cost allocation of the long-term regional transmission facilities. The final rule completely eviscerates the state agreement process and renders it non-viable. The final rule eliminates the core element of that approach, that states enter such cost allocation arrangements voluntarily. He goes on to state that now the final rule, I'm cutting to the chase here, tells the states that they must agree to a cost allocation or the transmission providers will impose one on them anyway. States simply cannot say no. He claims that this forced cost allocation on the states is contrary to comments of NARUC and many other states. As a result, I'm just about finished here. In effect, he believes that the final rule will enable the ratepayers of non-consenting states to be assessed the cost of public policy projects of other states, which he contends is anti-democratic and violates the basic principles of fairness. Of course, as NARUC had pointed out, NARUC and individual state commissions supported the state agreement process to address this concern, where a state agreement approach would allow states to further their public policy goals without burdening the ratepayers of states that have different priorities. And he basically concludes, unfortunately, the state agreement process appears to be eviscerated by the rule under Order 1920. I guess I'd have two questions for you. First of all, I want your take on his views. And in that context, we've already addressed, I think, to some extent, what should be the SPP response to this FERC rule. But a companion question to me, and a really serious question for us within the state is, what should the state of Kansas or the commission do to protect Kansas ratepayers and landowners from any potentially egregious effects or consequences of this FERC rule, which appears to be somewhat preemptive? Those are the two leading questions of the morning.
Well, I'm going to disappoint you. You
will never, Chair
on
French,
my-
you will never disappoint me.
I'm going to admit all I've done so far is skim the rule. I've done word searches for some key terms that I wanted to make sure I saw how they were addressed. I have read Commissioner Christie's dissent. I have read the concurrence. If anything, at this point, I would suggest the state strongly support the rule because I think it's beneficial to the state, and I don't think it in any way damages any of the protections that currently exist for Kansas ratepayers and Kansas landowners. I want to reserve a lot of judgment until I dig in further to the rule and the details of the rule and how it might impact our planning processes. I mean, as we said, it is 1,316 pages if you include, or 60 pages if you include the dissents and the concurrences. But I will say, I mean, I have read the dissent. I watched the meeting. I saw Commissioner Christie's comments. Commissioner Christie is an engaging fellow. He's very sharp. He's a law professor. I respect what he has put forward. I hope to talk to him about it. I don't want to ascribe any bad faith to his comments. I don't think he was intentionally trying to create, political divisions. Unfortunately, I think that was the result of what he put forward. I think if you dig in to the processes, I think what you will find is that his comments are quite misguided and reflect a misunderstanding of the interplay between transmission planning, project selection, and then the ability to create a cost allocation framework to properly assign the costs of any projects that are selected, if they are. Commissioner Christie made some pretty broad statements that the rule is going to require certain projects to be built for things like a state's public policy goals, or for a corporation's, say, sustainability goals, and that that other states' residents are going to be forced to pay for those. That is not true. That is a broad generalization and something that we account for both in the selection process and in the cost allocation process in SPP. So with, at least with respect to our region, I do not have any concerns with the things that he identified. They simply are not concerns in our region. I think a lot of Commissioner Christie's comments reflect his experience within the PJM region and his desire to see something like the state's agreement approach to cost allocation there. We have a different approach. This rule does not prohibit our approach. In fact, I was most concerned that they would make a reform that would change our approach or would make us have to take a different approach. I think there is a frustration that he has that the sort of the PJM state agreement approach was not mandated for more regions. Frankly, I would have, as I said, I would have been very concerned if we had gone down that path where individual states could basically veto or opt out of planning portfolios, because that would greatly hinder the ability of a region to plan and receive benefits together. So I hate to disappoint, but my early read is I just, while I count Commissioner Christie among my friends and love to have the debate with him, I think a lot of the concerns that he lines out, one, are not specifically concerns in SPP, but two, I think they mischaracterize sort of the minimum standards that are set forth in the rule and how those are going to play out. I think he makes a lot of assumptions about how people are going to use the rule rather than the flexibility that the rule actually provides. So, I say all of that, and I probably have said too much for somebody that has not read the full 1,400 pages. I promise you, this is a rule I do intend to read front to back and make sure I fully understand the interplay. If anything on my assessment changes, I will commit to bring it to you. I will bring it to everybody throughout the state. As I said, we want to make sure that this does still work with our planning processes, that we aren't doing anything in the planning and selection process that hinders our ability to fairly allocate costs. But my read so far is that we maintain all the flexibility to do what we need to do to protect ratepayers. So I probably have a little different read than the Commissioner Christie dissent so far, but I will be taking his dissent and cross-checking it with the actual words of the order and making hopefully an independent assessment. I don't want to take the word of the concurring opinion, and I don't want to take the word of the dissenting opinion. I want to make my own assessment. So that's as much of a response as I think I can give you right now. But I just would be cautious to take either one of those positions, the dissent or the concurrence, at face value right now as fact, particularly as fact for our region. I think people are speaking from their own perspectives. Unfortunately, we don't have a commissioner with a lot of SPP, or a FERC commissioner with a lot of SPP experience. So I would hesitate to ask any of them how they think it's going to affect us. And I really hope we can make our own assessment on how it will affect us.
I appreciate your views very much, Commissioner French. You can't disappoint because I was asking for your opinion. So I'm willing to take it full at face value what your opinion is, no matter what it is, because I don't go I'm not going into the questioning process with any predisposition. The concern that I have, it comes from, I've met Commissioner Christie once. I wouldn't even pretend to know the man other than through his writings and through his opinions and through what I've seen in his public appearances. But the man has a lot of credibility to me simply because he, as is the case with Chair Phillips, they both came from being state commissioners to the position on FERC. He was a former Virginia commissioner, And I've always considered him to be really deliberative. And I'm not suggesting that you're thinking anything else. Please, I'm not saying that. But I think that there's a certain credibility that I think comes with that. And the concern that I had, as I said, if I were to take from among the three concerns I really generically noted and probably overgeneralized, maybe not in terrible fairness to Commissioner Christie, who's not here to defend himself, but the one that I was
I'm sure he'd like to be here.
well, I love having him here too. The one that I was most concerned with is this cost allocation business. This is really serious stuff, especially as we have a growth of SPP, as we have the interconnection growth, all the things that are happening between and among the various RTOs and all the other players out here. I'm concerned because Kansas is going to be is going to be ground zero for wind energy. We have wind energy resources that are probably second to none in the country, and I just want to make sure if this is designed for export that we're going to be fairly compensated for this, and that we're not going to end up paying for benefits that are significantly, if not totally, delivered for export to other states. Anyway, that's my take.
One thing I just would want to emphasize is I want to read the rule to get through some of the details, but frankly, a lot of it is not that dissimilar. As I went back and did some comparisons, it's not dissimilar from what was originally proposed in the NOPR, which Commissioner Christie did vote for the NOPR. But as he said, I mean, I think some of the cost allocation reforms were not adopted, and so since he voted for it as a package deal, that's why he didn't feel comfortable adopting the final rule. But one thing I do want to emphasize is just there is this interplay of what sort of scenarios you might plan for in your planning processes, but then just because you plan for those scenarios, and you might identify potential ways to solve for those scenarios, there is then a separate selection process where the region and all the stakeholders and the RTO can decide whether you actually want to build for those scenarios, whether they are actually right for your customers. And then there is yet another area where the states, at least in SPP, do have authority over cost allocation. So even once the region decides to build, say they decide to build to accommodate large users, green energy plans, renewable energy resources, there is then that final stage where the commissioners from all the states will get to vote on a mechanism to make sure those costs are fairly assigned to those that benefit from them. So I have been assured, and everything I have read in the rule does not change that general framework, that we will still be able to handle that. And I really wanted to highlight, the consolidated planning process that Sherry brought up, and where this issue first came up, is we really think that is going to be a much better way to handle these potential future issues and make sure costs get fairly assigned. I know that the word I used when I spoke to the legislature, or the phrase I used, was making sure there aren't free riders, latching on to investments that are made. And we really think the consolidated planning process is going to be something that's going to allow our region to do that, and to make sure we apportion those costs that you talk about in the right way. And so I guess that's why my biggest concern is just making sure that the things we want to do in the process that we in our region are starting to stake out, that they aren't negatively impacted by the rule. And I'm committing now, I'm going to dig into this rule. I'm going to make sure that that it doesn't infringe on our ability to handle those issues. But it's a big deal. I don't at all fault anybody for bringing it up. Perhaps we need to schedule more open sessions to flesh it out. Perhaps we need to bring in council or someone else to do maybe a public education session for us, give us an outline, and identify some areas maybe we need to educate a little more on. So I'm very happy to to have the conversation. I'm going to need a little more time to read to read all those pages since it came out on what was it, the 13th? Was that Tuesday, Monday? Yeah. So I think we all will, but those are my initial thoughts.
Okay, thank you. The additional granularity that you've added and the different additional perspectives, very helpful, Chair French, and I appreciate that very much. I have one other companion concern that I want to bring up and have us address as well, because I think it's a concern with what I can't yet grasp the totality of the consequences that are going to ensue from this. But it arises from the Department of Energy's designation of about 450 miles in Kansas as a national interest transmission corridor. And in effect, to me, as I read it, it establishes federal preemption for siting and permitting of electric transmission in Kansas. One of the things I was concerned about, and Commissioner Christie touched upon it in his dissenting opinion, was this sort of stated position, unless I'm reading it wrong, of federal supremacy for siting and permitting on electric transmission lines. And now we have a transmission corridor here that is evidently not in the view of FERC is not the province of state concern anymore. Am I reading that wrong?
I would add a little nuance on it. And again, this is another rulemaking that I have not fully read, but I did participate in a task force meeting with the FERC commissioners to try to give state feedback on this. And I followed the sort of the Kansas feedback that was given. We filed comments in the docket. Our biggest concerns, because a lot of this is already in federal statute, there's not much we can influence, but we could influence the rulemaking. And the one big thing. So first of all, as far as the comment about taking it out of the province of the states, I think I would disagree to some extent. I think the rule does recognize that it is concurrent jurisdiction, that both the states and the federal government would have siting authority. And so one of the proposals that was made in the rulemaking was to speed things up. FERC initially proposed that they would run their siting process concurrently at the exact same time that the state was running its siting process. And we pushed back on that. We said, look, we recognize that the statute says that the feds can come in if we fail to approve a siting permit, that they can come in and have their own siting process and consider that permit. But there are a lot of reasons why that doesn't make sense to do it at the exact same time. One, we would like to participate in that federal process, and that's going to be really difficult if our staff and our commissioners are all tied up in our own siting process. Two, that is very confusing to landowners who don't know which process they should be involved in if you have a federal siting process and a corollary state siting process for the same infrastructure going on in a singular docket or at a singular time, but in two separate dockets. They don't know what to participate in. And then third, just the company itself or any interested stakeholders, it's very difficult to participate in two proceedings at the same time. And so we pushed back and said, at the very least, the federal process should not start until the state process has concluded and we've made a determination. And I think in the final rulemaking, they did adopt that recommendation and they did decide to wait until state proceedings end. The other thing I would point out on the NHTSA designation, I think some of us were a little surprised to see the designation in Kansas. I think it is pretty obvious that for most of those miles, that is a designation of a corridor of a line we have already cited. We have already granted siting authority to the Grain Belt Express Clean Line, which basically runs where that west to east line is. I think we are reaching out now to try to understand, at least I've heard our staff is reaching out to try to understand what the purpose of that is. I understand there are some additional maybe federal funds and resources that can flow to local communities and for outreach. And so maybe that is solely the purpose, because there would be no need for the federal government to issue a line sighting permit for something we've already cited. The other concern I have is, even though we have cited that line, we have cited the line with a buffer of, I think, 660 feet on either side. The corridor would establish a NHTSA corridor of 5 miles wide, which is much wider than what we have cited. And so we are reaching out to also understand what the purpose of that 5 mile buffer is. Is that assuming future infrastructure? Is it simply a formality? That's something I think we would like some more clarity on. I know I've talked to staff. I hope the other commissioners are talking to staff. I think there's maybe a 45-day window for us to provide comments to DOE on this. So I think it does make sense for us to be gathering information and then make some determination on whether we need to provide comments to the DOE. So I don't know that I hit everything you said, Commissioner Keen, but those are all the thoughts that have been rattling around in my head on this NHTSA designation.
I appreciate that very much. I'll just say, just so that you'll know it from whence I come in asking that question. I've been over the course of my career, I've been in and out of several different state positions. This is the second of several of those where issues of federal preemption and whether or not there was federal supremacy and the extent to that has come to the fore very prominently. I have some level of cynicism about that because I think that a lot of knowledge is local. I think a lot of things that are in the best interest of Kansas, we're in a better position to know than the feds are to try to impose it upon us. Yeah. So having said that, to me, when I see that there is basically at least the signs of a potential, I'll use the word, overreach into trying to seek basically preemptive authority or to assert preemptive authority, I have concerns, and that's really the genesis of my concern and my question. So I appreciate your take on it.
Yeah, and that actually reminds me of one additional thing that the commission had put in its written comments to FERC, and I need to dig in and see if this was addressed in the rulemaking. But I know we had said in our written comments, and I told the commissioners in person at our task force meeting that, at the very least, we would hope that the FERC would not come in and grant a siting permit where we have found it was not appropriate. But at the very least, if they decided that the granting of a siting permit was necessary, we would hope they would look at our proceeding and perhaps defer at least to the route that the commission had identified as the best local route for a line to take, rather than just making their own determination. So I don't know where the final rule ended up on that. That's something that needs review. But I think the general feedback we gave was, if they think they have supremacy, please exercise it in the most narrow possible way. And if there are areas where you can defer to local decision making, you should always select those areas.
Well, I would hope they would follow that approach. I think I'm perhaps a bit more, maybe a lot more cynical about you than you are in terms of whether or not they'll actually do that, or actually follow even a commitment that this one party makes and another party superior to that party changes. So anyway, well, Sherry, I didn't mean to leave you out of this discussion. So if there's anything you'd care to add, please do.
No, I haven't had time this week to read either rule, and I'll follow the wise words of one of my law school professors. Don't think great thoughts, just read the rule.
Yeah. Yeah.
Thank you I appreciate all of you, your indulgence in this. I appreciate the colloquy with you, Commissioner Chair French, as well.
Yeah,
thank you.
Absolutely. Well, Sherry, anything else on your update? I think you reached your questions slide. Oh, you're on mute.
Oh, sorry, I don't have anything else. I just would say that if you have questions, and I will try to make sure I get you the Western utilities that will be coming in with the expansion as well as the potential state commissions. And I'll get you that
Alright.
map too.
Thank you so much, Sherry.
Sure.
Well,
Thank you.
with that, we have certainly come to the conclusion of all the items noticed on today's agenda. And if there is nothing more to come before us this morning, I would entertain a motion to adjourn. Oh, Commissioner Keither, your mouth is moving, but
I move that we adjourn.
Second.
I got a motion and a second to adjourn. All in favor, please vote aye.
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 Aye. We are adjourned. Thank you all. Take care.
Take care.